We've now seen how a single price can emerge across two markets that would otherwise have different prices when trade between those two markets happens. So we had the market for corn in Iowa with a low price in the absence of trade, and the market for corn in North Carolina with a high price for corn in the absence of trade. But that difference in prices causes exporters to buy at the low price and sell at the high price, and that pushes price up in Iowa and pushes price down in North Carolina until the prices are roughly equalized. As a result, more is produced and consumed in Iowa, and that's the amount that gets shipped to North Carolina. And we can already see who wins and who loses from trade in this case. In North Carolina, the price falls. A drop in prices is good for consumers, but it's not so good for firms. So firms lose in North Carolina and consumers win. In Iowa, the opposite happens. In Iowa, the price increases, which is bad for consumers and good for firms. So consumers in Iowa win and firms in Iowa lose. The bigger question is, are the winnings overall greater or smaller than the losses overall? In other words, is overall surplus increasing, despite the fact that there are some winners and some losers in both regions? And we can already see that in these pictures as well. Originally, without trade, the price in North Carolina was high. Consumers got the surplus above that price up to the demand curve. Firms got the surplus below that price down to the supply curve, so the overall surplus is just this triangle formed by the supply and demand curves. After trade is allowed, we have a drop in the price. As a result, consumers consume more, and their surplus is everything above the magenta price up to the demand curve, including this triangle. Producer surplus drops because of the lower price to the smaller area, and some of that surplus that producers used to get simply now happens for consumers. It simply gets transferred. But this triangle wasn't there before, so that's an increase in overall surplus in North Carolina. The same thing happens in Iowa. In Iowa, originally we had this price at the intersection of supply and demand. Consumer surplus was everything up to the demand curve. Producer surplus everything down to the supply curve. So this was our overall surplus. When the price rises, producer surplus is now everything below the magenta price, down to the supply curve, including this triangle. Producer surplus now also includes some of what used to be consumer surplus because consumer surplus shrinks, but that's just transferred from consumers to producers. But this triangle wasn't there before. It's now there, and it's the overall increase in surplus as a result of trade in Iowa. So we can identify the winners and the losers from trade, but we can also see that overall surplus in both regions has increased as a result of trade. Now suppose that farmers in North Carolina get upset because they've seen this drop in the price of corn, and they're hurt by that. So they lobby the legislature to impose a tax on all corn that's imported from Iowa. So a tax on imports, that's called a tariff. And suppose that tax is passed. So now, for every bushel of corn that gets loaded off a truck that comes from Iowa, the exporters have to pay a tax, a per unit tax for that bushel of corn. Well, that's going to cause those exporters to not want to buy as much corn in Iowa. They're not going to want to push the price all the way up to where the price is equalized, because they know they still have to pay that per unit tax. So they're going to stop buying corn earlier, causing the price in Iowa to drop from the magenta price. And that's going to cause the quantity of corn that they're going to ship to North Carolina to decrease from that larger quantity to that smaller difference. That means they're not supplying as much corn in North Carolina, which means they're going to shift the supply curve by less than they did before, which means the price is going to stop dropping earlier. So there's now a difference in prices that emerges between the two regions. The price in North Carolina will be higher than the price in Iowa. A difference, a wedge, a tax wedge emerges And that's going to be equal to exactly the per unit tax that North Carolina has imposed on Iowa corn. It's exactly equal because when it's exactly equal, then it justifies the exporters stopping to buy here, because when they buy here and then pay the tax, they can sell it exactly for that price in North Carolina. It's a little bit like the compensating wage differential for actuaries in our example of math teachers and actuaries. There was a reason for a wage difference to emerge in equilibrium. There's now a reason for a price difference across North Carolina and Iowa to emerge in equilibrium because North Carolina has imposed a per unit tax on Iowa corn. So the exporters have to get compensated for the fact that they're going to have to pay this tax. And so that tax is a compensating price differential for these exporters. So different prices are now going to emerge, and the bigger that tax, the bigger that difference will be. And less corn is going to be shipped from Iowa to North Carolina. The quantity supplied and the quantity demanded in Iowa is going to narrow. So that's what's going to be exported, and it will be equal to this difference in North Carolina.